It's becoming increasingly clear, even to the casual observer, that the United States now operates under two separate constitutions. And today we're going to be looking at Christopher Caldwell's great book, Age of Entitlement, where he outlines the process by which America developed a secondary, informal constitution running parallel to the one that we are all familiar with, and explores the consequences of bifurcating the American justice system in this manner. Caldwell traces the origins of this second constitution to the civil rights movement. He believes that the civil rights movement began as a well-intentioned effort by most Americans to deliver on the promise of racial equality when it came to the law after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Caldwell says that the psychic shock of Kennedy's death had a serious impact on the nation, and that his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, was very successful in tying the idea of the civil rights movement to Kennedy's legacy, generating the social capital and goodwill necessary to make the big moves required by that kind of legislation. According to Caldwell, Americans of the 1960s saw the Deep South as the only region that really needed this kind of major change. And most Americans who were backing this kind of legislation did not expect it to actually impact them where they lived. You see, the fact is that in the South, it was very difficult to get these kind of reforms passed through a democratic process. And so LBJ and civil rights advocates basically had to work to circumvent the normal democratic process to get these things done. Now, these changes may eventually have come through the normal channels had they been given time, but this was seen as an emergency situation, a pressing civil rights issue, something tied to the legacy of a newly dead president, and essential to the healing of a country that had to be moved forward with whatever means were necessary. This meant a patchwork of legal decisions backed by legislation that in many ways questioned rights that were thought to have been in the Constitution, like freedom of association. These legal decisions and legislation were also paired with unprecedented pressure from the federal bureaucracy, which eventually began to work their magic but far beyond the scope of the original intention. Things like forced busing integration programs didn't simply apply to rural Alabama or Louisiana, they started being applied across the country, and suddenly states and voters who never thought that these rules would actually impact them were suddenly living under their consequences. Most people today would probably agree with the eventual outcomes of those methods, but it's impossible to say that those methods did not create a new precedent for the way that large-scale changes could be brought to the American public and implemented at lightning speed without the necessity of large-scale democratic consensus. And with the obvious success of this civil rights strategy, an increasing number of groups wanted to use it to their advantage. First immigrants, then women, then the disabled, followed by gay and trans individuals, all sought to use this new second constitution that had been created by this patchwork of civil rights legislation and court rulings to move their concerns into the fast lane and bypass the slow, exhausting work of changing public opinion over time in order to influence the democratic process. This didn't go unnoticed by political parties, and slowly a coalition began to form around those who had access to the second constitution. Odd terms like people of color started to arise, which seemed to have no particular definition except those that had access to the second constitution. Of course, women and eventually LGBT concerns were also added to this coalition. This meant that a program which was initially conceived and supported by the majority of Americans as a way to right the wrongs visited on 15% of the population was now being applied to over half the country. The majority of the country now in some way qualified as a minority and therefore had access to the second constitution. This naturally started to create a second class of citizens who became a minority by being left out of the civil rights coalition, and started to notice that they had fewer rights than those around them as they tried to follow the old constitution to increasing levels of failure and frustration. The truth is that whatever the inequalities of the past, there was a new politically advantaged class emerging. who increasingly saw due process as a barrier to their well-deserved liberation. Under the precedent set by civil rights legislation, a newly entitled class seemed to demand increasingly direct and immediate solutions to their every perceived injustice. Americans were asked to make more and more severe changes to their lifestyles in order to accommodate more and more vanishingly small minorities. Formal legislation no longer seemed required to make significant changes to people's constitutional rights, while judges and executive branch officials seemed willing to hand over legal and regulatory authority to private and extrajudicial bodies, culminating in the Obama administration's issuance of a Dear Colleague letter under Title IX, which essentially set up kangaroo courts for those on college campuses across the country. Anyone accused of something like sexual harassment could now basically be convicted by someone who was in no way part of the judicial system without any kind of evidence necessary. This second constitution that has enabled civil rights issues to basically be fast-tracked in any situation and circumvent traditional legislative and judicial requirements has now deeply embedded itself in the American psyche. Students are now taught through both school and things like television programs and movies that civil rights are the entire reason for the existence of the United States. The only good thing about the United States, according to this mantra, the only positive development that's ever happened in the United States is the development of civil liberties. This has become the state religion. This has become the wellspring of state authority. In many people's eyes, the legitimacy of the government comes from its ability to secure more and more civil rights. And of course, this means in many ways that the search for more civil rights can never end, because that would mean that the expansion of government power was no longer something that was necessary. There would no longer be something driving that forward. It also means that pretty much anything is justified in securing those civil rights, and any kind of impediment to that process that happens to be left over from the old Constitution is unacceptable. Institutions like the Senate and the Electoral College are seen as vestigial organs of racism, standing in the way of inevitable and righteous progress which must be destroyed. Equal application of the law is obviously also unacceptable. Bad people who are hindering the progress of civil rights do not deserve the protection of law enforcement or anyone else and are subject to entirely different rules. There have recently been an increasing number of obvious and painful reminders that this process is underway. People who stand up and oppose BLM rioters as they enter their neighborhoods to intimidate individuals and destroy property are often detained or arrested while the rioters are allowed to continue to harass and terrorize innocent civilians. There is simply no such thing as a crime committed in the name of the state religion. There are now two constitutions, two justice systems, two classes of citizens in the United States. And whether those who started this process were well-intentioned or not, the consequences have become a disaster which are tearing the country apart. Thanks for watching, guys. As always, if you liked the video, please go ahead and click like. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time to do so. If you'd like to contribute to my work, like the fine people who are currently being displayed on the screen, you can click the link to my Subscribe Star, which is in the video description below. You'll also find the link to the merch store if you'd like to support me that way, and there's a link to my Twitter if you want to follow me there. Also, make sure to follow me on alternative platforms like Odyssey and Rumble if you want to make sure you keep getting the content. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.